Why was the air so heavy that morning, when the sky itself was clear? The sun had only just climbed high enough to spill across the naval base, its light striking every polished boot and mirrored button. 458 soldiers stood at perfect attention, silent, immovable. Rows of discipline, rows of tradition. And somewhere among them, almost invisible at first glance, stood Lieutenant Sarah. 5'4", straight posture, navy dress blues. Nothing about her drew the eye unless you knew where to look. Yet on this morning, one glance would be all it took for history to change. Sarah had been taught to never expect fairness, only to prepare for the fight. Her parents had fled war-torn Southeast Asia with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a handful of hope. They built their lives on night shifts and exhaustion, working jobs that ate at their bones, yet never complained. That grit carved itself into her, deeper than bloodlines. From the moment she turned 18 and signed her enlistment papers, she knew the Navy wouldn't bend to her. She would have to bend it. And she had. She rose not by privilege, not by legacy, not by the easy way doors sometimes open for others. She earned every stripe through late-night watches where exhaustion whispered quit, through machinery that engineers, yet bowed when her hands touched it, through storms at sea that should have swallowed men whole, where she pulled sailors from death with a rope, bare hands, and stubbornness no typhoon could rip away. She had done all that, and still this morning carried a chill, something unseen, something waiting. At the front of the formation, Admiral Robert approached the podium. The silver-haired legend, 62 years old, tall as authority itself, chest weighed down with decades of ribbons and his own sense of importance. He didn't just command rooms, he expected them to orbit him. His voice was iron when he began, sharp enough that even officers checked their uniforms instinctively, though none had moved. The speech was supposed to be ceremonial, a farewell to his post, a symbolic handover to his successor. He spoke of duty, of honor, of tradition, words every soldier had heard so often they might as well have been carved into the concrete beneath their boots. But then the air shifted. It started small, a tone too sharp, a word too loaded. At first it could have been nerves or old habits, but the veterans in the crowd felt it. The speech was hardening, its edge cutting deeper with each sentence. His gaze began sweeping across the formation, no longer proud but predatory. And then it found her. The pause was barely a breath, but everyone sensed it. Sarah did not move, did not blink, did not allow the smallest flicker of thought to cross her face. Inside, however, alarms rang. She had survived enough of these moments to recognize the setup, a superior looking for a symbol, looking for prey. "Lieutenant," his voice finally cut through the silence. It cracked the morning wide open. Every soldier stiffened. This was no accident. Ceremonies didn't call out names, not like this, not in front of everyone. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. Her voice was steady, anchored in the discipline drilled into her bones. He began to move then, away from the podium toward her. His shoes clicked against the polished ground, deliberate, measured, a man making the stage his own. 8 years of service, he said. Is that correct? Yes, sir. He began circling her, slow like a shark. Tell me, Lieutenant, do you believe your gender has played any role in your advancement? Do you think, perhaps, in the Navy's eagerness to demonstrate diversity, certain standards were lowered for you? The words landed like poison. Every soldier in earshot knew what this was. Not a question, not curiosity, an accusation dressed as inquiry. Sarah's anger rose like a tide, but she kept it contained. Years of discipline had taught her too. She had faced whispers before, the sideways glances, the quiet remarks, the subtle suggestion that her uniform was earned differently than theirs. She had carried it in silence because the mission mattered more. But this wasn't silence. This wasn't private. This was a stage, and she was being forced onto it. She answered carefully, her tone respectful. Sir, my record reflects my qualifications and performance. My fitness scores exceed requirements. My record of service speaks for itself." Dismissal flashed across face as he waved a hand. Paperwork, test scores, controlled environments. But what about the real thing? What about when the world doesn't care about your politics or your inclusion programs? The crowd stirred. Soldiers weren't fools. They could feel the trap. If she objected, she would be branded as weak. If she accepted, she was admitting her record wasn't enough, that she still had to prove she belonged. It was no longer a ceremony. It was a spectacle. And knew it. His smile was cold as he spoke again. "You'll prove yourself here and now, Lieutenant, to your fellow sailors, to your service, to me." The silence was suffocating. Sarah's chest rose with a steady breath. Her mind raced, but outwardly she remained stone. He wants me cornered. He wants me humiliated. And yet she knew what he underestimated. "I'm prepared to demonstrate my qualifications in any appropriate manner, sir," she said, her voice carrying across the formation. Something in her tone silenced even the gulls overhead. Quiet confidence, steel under velvet. His eyes lit with satisfaction. "Excellent, hand-to-hand combat proficiency. Every officer should possess it. Let's see yours." Gasps rippled across the ranks. No one moved, but the disbelief was palpable. A public fight. At a change of command ceremony. An admiral against a lieutenant. Still stripped off his jacket, folded it with calm deliberation, handed it to his aide. His sleeves rolled up with a ritual precision, like this was theater, like humiliation itself would be his legacy. Sarah removed her jacket as well. She handed it to Petty Officer Martinez, whose eyes betrayed a flash of horror. Her movements were deliberate, calm, betraying nothing of the storm inside. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't training. This was her career, maybe her life, balanced on a single confrontation she hadn't asked for. The soldiers unconsciously formed a circle, 458 bodies shifting just slightly, closing around them. The morning light burned against the concrete, and in its sharp glow, the arena was set. Spoke loudly, almost performative. No weapons, no dirty tactics, just a demonstration of skills. Sarah nodded. She had sparred countless times in training, but this was different. Every decision would be judged, every move remembered, every breath witnessed. He circled her again, but this time the performance was gone. His steps were heavier, his eyes sharper. He was no longer giving a speech, he was hunting. "Whenever you're ready, Admiral," she said. Her voice didn't waver. The first strike came fast. A right hand straight toward her face, backed by 62 years of arrogance and authority. But arrogance does not equal skill. She slipped it, just a fraction of movement, but enough. His fist sliced empty air. His balance shifted forward, unsteady for a beat. Murmurs erupted in the crowd. Sarah could have countered ribs, throat, solar plexus, but she didn't. Not yet. Her restraint was deliberate. She wasn't here to destroy. She was here to survive. His expression hardened, surprise flashing into anger. His voice lost its casual tone. "Impressive reflexes. Let's see how long they hold." This time he attacked with a combination left jab, right cross, heavy, quick, meant to overwhelm. She ducked, stepped inside, close enough that his reach became his disadvantage. For a heartbeat, she had every option: ribs, elbow, throat. She could have ended it. But she stepped back. Still defense, still restraint. The murmurs grew louder. The circle of soldiers shifted. What they were witnessing was no longer the Admiral's show. It was his unraveling. And deep inside, Sarah felt it too, a shift she hadn't expected: hope. Because the longer this dragged on, the more obvious it became to every watching eye. Wasn't proving anything. He was exposing himself. And that realization was dangerous, because men like him, when embarrassed, did not retreat. They escalated. And she could feel it coming. Why didn't anyone stop him? That was the thought burning in Sarah's mind as came at her again, heavier this time. his shoes scraping across the concrete as his fists cut the air with frustration. Around them, the circle of soldiers stood frozen. Captains, lieutenants, chiefs, and ensigns alike, every one of them rigid in their silence, bound by the unspoken truth of military hierarchy. No one dared intervene against an admiral, not even when his behavior veered into madness. And Sarah knew it. She was on her own. Lunged, hands reaching to trap her in a bear hug, brute force against agility. But she had trained for this. Not in classrooms, not in theory, but in sweaty gyms where instructors threw her against walls and told her again and again, speed is survival. She slipped out of his grasp, fluid, controlled. His arms caught nothing but air. He stumbled, regaining balance with a grunt. The murmurs in the formation grew louder now, subtle ripples through the sea of uniforms. Even the veterans, hardened sailors who had seen storms and war, were unsettled. This was no longer a demonstration. This was desperation. "Stand still and fight like a soldier," barked. His voice cracked with something raw, unmasked. Sarah's reply was calm, steady, but with a steel edge. "I am fighting like a soldier, sir, by doctrine, mobility, defense, awareness." Her words were technically correct, delivered with courtesy, but the truth beneath them was sharper than any blade. She was exposing him with every missed strike, every wild swing. She was making him look reckless, untrained. And he knew it. His jaw tightened, his breath uneven. Sweat dampened his temples, for all his gym-honed pride was 62. He was fit, yes, but not conditioned for combat. Not like her. Not anymore. Another attack. This time, a lunge born not of training but rage. His arms outstretched, a tackle rather than a strike. Sarah smoothly, guiding his momentum with one hand, sending him staggering into the flagpole that rose from the center of the parade ground. The impact rang metallic, a hollow clang, jolted, stumbled, straightened slowly. Gasps shivered across the formation. He wasn't hurt badly, not yet. Sarah had controlled the redirection, avoiding real harm. But she had also made something unmistakably clear. She could have ended this at any time. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that presses into ears until the smallest sound feels deafening. Sarah's voice carried into that silence, even, respectful, offering him a way out. "Sir, I believe proficiency has been demonstrated. Perhaps we should return to the ceremony." For one breath, one fragile moment, she thought he might take it, that he might accept the dignity she offered, salvage what remained of the morning. But pride is a dangerous thing. His face twisted. The arrogance that had once cloaked him in authority was gone, stripped bare by humiliation. What remained was something darker. The predator mask was gone. What stood before her now was a cornered animal. "You think you're better than me," hissed, his voice low but carrying across the circle. "You think your promotions, your quotas, your diversity programs make you equal to me. No, you're nothing, and I'll prove it right here." The words hit like strikes of their own, not because they were true, but because of the years behind them, years of fighting that same shadow in whispers, in doubts, in the tired sighs of women told they didn't belong. It wasn't just Sarah he insulted. It was every woman in uniform, every immigrant who clawed for respect, every quiet soldier who worked twice as hard for half the recognition. The 458 soldiers heard it too, and something shifted in them, a current Sarah could feel even without looking. This wasn't about her alone anymore. This was about them, about the institution, about what kind of navy they served in. And blinded by his fury, couldn't see it. He charged. No pause, no theater, no control, just a man swinging with intent to destroy. His right hook came hard, aimed straight for her face, carrying every ounce of his weight, his anger, his prejudice. Time slowed. In training, instructors drilled the mechanics, the physics of leverage, the mathematics of timing. But combat wasn't math. It was instinct. And instinct whispered, he will not stop. Not this time. He means to break you. Something inside Sarah shifted. The discipline she had clung to, restraint, courtesy, protocol, snapped like a rope pulled too tight. This was no longer sparring, no longer ceremony. This was survival. She didn't retreat, she stepped in. The movement was small, precise. She cut into the arc of his strike, slipping beneath the power of his swing. Her left hand caught his wrist. Her right clamped onto his upper arm. His momentum became hers to command. And in one fluid pivot, she turned his strength into weakness. The sound came sharp, sickening, clean. A crack that echoed across the parade ground. Collapsed to his knees, his arm folded unnaturally, pain written across every line of his face. His scream tore through the mourning, raw animal, stripped of dignity. The circle of soldiers froze, some flinched, some inhaled sharply, but none spoke, none moved. The admiral, the untouchable authority, was broken, literally. Sarah released him the instant she felt the bone give, stepping back, controlled, professional even in the aftermath. Her chest rose and fell evenly. Her hands didn't tremble. She looked down at him, not with triumph, not with cruelty, but with the heavy realization of what had just been done. "Medical assistance to the parade ground," she called. Her voice was steady, ringing across the silence. It was instinct, leadership drilled into her bones, first care, then command. Several corpsmen rushed forward, breaking formation at last, their boots clattering against the concrete. The circle dissolved into movement. Clutched his ruined arm, eyes burning with humiliation even through the agony. Sarah stood still, her body rigid with discipline, but her mind was a storm. She had defended herself. She had done what training demanded, but the truth pressed into her like a weight. She had broken an admiral in front of 458 witnesses. And there would be no undoing it. Orders cracked across the parade ground now, Captain Williams, successor, taking control with sharp efficiency. Secure the area, make room for medical, get base hospital. His voice steadied the chaos, but his eyes betrayed shock. The ambulance siren soon pierced the air, echoing through the base. The story was already spreading, faster than wheels could roll. Sarah remained at attention, uniform neat except for her missing jacket, breath even, eyes forward. On the outside, she looked every bit the soldier she had always been. But inside, one thought echoed with cold finality. Her life in the Navy had just split into two eras, before this moment and after. Why did silence feel heavier than any scream? Sarah sat alone in her quarters, the walls too white, too clean, too empty of sound. The ceremony had ended in chaos, but for her, it had ended in this room, a kind of confinement that wasn't prison but felt close enough. She was not under arrest, not yet, but she was contained, confined to quarters until further notice. The phrase carried weight. It meant she was no longer free, not really. She could eat, she could sleep, but she couldn't walk outside without permission, couldn't speak to anyone about what had happened, couldn't even lift the phone without wondering who might be listening. The Navy called it procedure. Sarah called it isolation. Her uniform hung neatly in the small locker across from her bed, the dress blues she had worn that morning still carrying faint traces of adrenaline and sunlight. She couldn't look at them without hearing it again, the sound. That sharp crack, unnatural, final, scream that followed. The sound of something breaking that couldn't be unbroken. And though every rational thought told her she had done the only thing possible, a voice inside whispered the question anyway. Did you go too far? She replayed it second by second, the fist swinging toward her face, the instinct that told her it was different this time, that this wasn't ceremony anymore, that he meant to harm her. She remembered stepping in, catching his arm, pivoting, technique, precision, survival. She hadn't wanted to break him. She had wanted to stop him. But the line between those two things blurred in that instant. Outside her door, boots echoed in hallways. The base hadn't slept since the incident. She could feel it in the rhythm of movement, The way voices carried lower than usual, as though every sailor on the base was trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. 458 pairs of eyes had seen her snap an admiral's arm. 458 memories that would shape the story long before investigators touched it. And stories traveled faster than truth. By nightfall, the base was buzzing. By morning, Washington would know. By the end of the day, the country. Sarah sat on her bed, elbows resting on her knees, hands covering her face. She wasn't crying. She couldn't cry, but her heart pressed against her chest as if trying to escape. 8 years she had clawed for respect. 8 years proving she belonged. And now, would anyone see anything except the woman who broke an admiral in front of an entire command? The knock at her door was sharp, 3 raps, authoritative. "Lieutenant," a voice said, calm, professional. "Captain, NCIS, we need to talk." Her stomach sank. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service. It hadn't even been 24 hours. They had wasted no time. She opened the door. Captain stood there, not in dress blues, but in the muted suit that marked investigators. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were calculating, trained to read her before she said a word. "Lieutenant," he said, nodding slightly, "we'll keep this informal for now, may we?" She stepped back and he entered with a legal pad tucked under his arm. He didn't sit right away. He scanned the room, the details, her neatness, the absence of personal clutter. Only then did he take the chair opposite her bed. "You understand why I'm here," he said. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady though her throat was dry. "Good, then let's start simple. Walk me through it. From the moment Admiral addressed you." She told it in careful detail, her words clipped, precise. She explained the speech, his shift in tone, his questions, his challenge. She explained her responses. She emphasized her restraint, how she had avoided harming him until his final attack. She described his swing, his fury, the moment she knew she had no choice but to act. Didn't interrupt. He only wrote, his pen scratching lightly, his eyes lifting occasionally to catch the tremor in her breath, the way her hands tightened unconsciously when she described the crack of bone. When she finished, the silence stretched. "Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice calm, almost gentle, "you understand the gravity of this situation. You broke a flag officer's arm, in public, in front of nearly 500 witnesses. Whatever the justification, this isn't going away." "I understand," she said, and she did too well. Leaned forward slightly. "From my perspective, the footage will matter most. Parade grounds have cameras, multiple angles. They'll tell us what words cannot. But the narrative, that's already being written outside these walls." Her pulse quickened. "Narrative, sir." "Reporters are outside the gate already," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Social media lit up within hours. Some are calling you a hero. Others are calling you insubordinate. It will only grow from here." Sarah inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. "So I'm already judged." "Not by me," said. "Not yet, but understand this. The Navy is under pressure. They'll want answers quickly, and they'll want someone to carry the weight of this." Her chest tightened. The weight, it had always been there, hadn't it? Carrying it for her parents, for the sailors she led, for every woman told she didn't belong. And now again. "Did you hate him?" asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "Sir, when he said those things, when he struck at you, did you hate him?" Sarah's eyes lowered. She thought of words, quota higher, nothing special, just another diversity token. Words like knives. Words meant to reduce her years of sweat and sacrifice to nothing. Her voice came quiet. "I hated what he represented, but I didn't hate him. I wanted it to stop, that's all." Studied her, then he nodded, scribbling one last note. "That's enough for tonight. We'll continue tomorrow." He stood, leaving her with the echo of boots down the hall, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone again, Sarah leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. Would it matter what she had intended? Or would history only remember the image, an admiral on his knees, screaming, and her standing over him? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Official channels only, restricted use during confinement. She hesitated before picking it up. A message marked urgent. Do not speak to media. Do not leave quarters. Investigation ongoing. Short cold. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone back down. For the first time in years she felt small, not in stature, in power. And beneath it all, a question gnawed. Would the Navy she gave everything to give anything back to her now? The silence pressed heavier. She lay back, eyes open to the ceiling, and waited for morning to come. Why did the world always move faster than the truth? By the next morning, Sarah's name was already on lips she had never met. The base gates were crowded with reporters, their cameras pointed at chain-link fences as if they could capture the echoes of what had happened on the parade ground. Headlines were being written in real time, each one twisting the story into something clean, sharp, and sensational. Female lieutenant breaks admiral's arm during Navy ceremony. Scandal at sea. Diversity hire humiliates top officer. Hero or disgrace. Navy officer takes down superior in public fight. The truth was still being dissected in a quiet office where investigators sifted through footage, testimony, and medical reports. But truth didn't sell as fast as spectacle. Sarah learned about it in fragments. A whispered comment from the corpsman who brought her breakfast tray. A muffled voice outside her door, sailors moving past, thinking she couldn't hear. And in each fragment she caught the same word again and again. Her name, carried like contraband through the base. 458 witnesses had gone back to their barracks, their shops, their offices. Officially, they were under strict orders not to discuss it. Unofficially, the story spread like fire. By noon, everyone had a version. Some said she'd dropped him with one strike. Some said she'd humiliated him on purpose. A few whispered she'd saved herself from being beaten unconscious. And Sarah, sitting in her quarters alone, with the walls pressing each hour, wondered which version the world would believe. Her phone buzzed again, another restricted message from command. Do not respond to outside communication. Do not make statements. All media inquiries to be handled by public affairs. Public affairs. The words landed bitter. She wasn't a person to them now, she was a crisis to manage. The knock at her door came mid-afternoon, sharp, precise. Lieutenant Captain again. She opened the door. The NCIS investigator entered, trailed this time by another officer, a woman in uniform, neat and composed. Dr. Santos said, base psychiatrist, she'll be assisting with assessment. Assessment? Sarah understood. They wanted to know if she was stable, if she was dangerous, if the moment on the parade ground had been survival or rage. Santos's eyes were steady, kind, but piercing. She sat across from Sarah, hands folded. Lieutenant, I'm here to understand the psychological factors of what happened yesterday. Nothing more. This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about context. Sarah nodded, though her stomach nodded. Context. Another word that could be twisted. Santos's questions were gentle but unrelenting. How had Sarah felt when called her out? What went through her mind when he insulted her? Did she feel fear? Anger? Did she ever want to strike him first? Each question peeled back layers Sarah had kept buried for years. The long nights where she had bitten her tongue against crude remarks. The times she had smiled past condescension to keep the mission moving. The invisible weight of being the example every time she walked into a room. I didn't want to hurt him, Sarah said finally, her voice low. I wanted it to stop, that's all. Santos studied her, then nodded. Your restraint was remarkable, but restraint has limits. Everyone has a breaking point. He forced you to yours. The words should have felt comforting. They didn't. After Santos left, remained, flipping open a folder. The footage is clear, escalated, he swung with intent. You defended, but Lieutenant, his eyes locked on hers. Intentions won't stop headlines. They won't stop politics. You're about to become more than a person in this story. What do you mean? Sarah asked. You're going to be a symbol, whether you want to or not. The words hit harder than any punch. A symbol, not Sarah, officer, daughter, sister. Not the girl whose parents had crossed oceans for a better life. Not the sailor who had pulled men from storm-swallowed waters. No, she would be the woman who broke an admiral. Symbols were clean, easy, disposable. Close the folder, his tone even. Stay steady. The truth will outlast the noise, but you need to be ready. The storm's just starting. He left her with those words, and when the door closed, the silence felt heavier than before. That night the base was restless. Sarah lay awake, the sounds of movement drifting through the thin walls. Somewhere outside, a sailor laughed too loudly, the sound cracking against the tension that hung over the installation. Somewhere else, a voice whispered her name like a curse. In the dark, Sarah stared at the ceiling. Guilt gnawed at her edges. Not guilt for defending herself, that was instinct, survival. No, the guilt was stranger, quieter. She wondered if she had just become the excuse people like had always needed. Proof, they'd say, that women didn't belong. Proof that diversity made the Navy weaker, not stronger. And yet, another thought pulsed beneath it. Or maybe this is proof of something else. Proof that strength doesn't always look the way they think it should. Her chest tightened with the weight of both possibilities. By morning, the storm had grown. She caught fragments again, this time from the corpsman who delivered her meal, eyes darting as though speaking was a crime. They're saying Congress might get involved, he whispered. They're saying this could go all the way up. Congress, the word hollowed her. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It wasn't even about. This was about the Navy's soul, dragged into public daylight by a moment no one could undo. At noon, Captain Williams himself arrived. The man who had been set to take command before the parade ground shattered into chaos. His face was pale, jaw tight, but his voice was measured. "Lieutenant," he said, "you are not to speak to anyone outside chain of command. Do not answer media. Do not engage with personnel gossiping. Understood?" "Yes, sir," she replied. His eyes lingered on her, conflicted. "I saw what happened. I know restraint when I see it. But this will not be judged by what I saw. It will be judged by how it's perceived. Prepare yourself." And then he was gone. Sarah sat in the silence once more, the weight pressing in. The Navy she had loved, the Navy she had bled for, was now deciding whether to protect her or sacrifice her to protect itself. She thought of her parents then, her mother's tired hands, her father's quiet endurance. They had survived humiliation, poverty, exile, not by fighting every battle but by standing when it mattered most. And she realized something that chilled her. This was no longer about proving she belonged. It was about whether she could endure being turned into something larger than herself. Because the storm outside her door wasn't just about one broken arm. It was about who gets to wear the uniform, who gets to lead, who gets to belong. And whether Sarah would be remembered as a caution or a catalyst. Why did it take breaking an arm for the truth to surface? The investigation moved faster than Sarah expected, yet each day felt endless inside her quarters. She saw the walls more than she saw people. The only visitors were the investigator or the corpsman delivering meals with eyes too careful, too heavy with what he wasn't allowed to say. Came back on the third day. His suit looked the same, but his eyes had changed. They carried the weight of discoveries, the kind that turned whispers into evidence. "Lieutenant," he said as he settled into the chair across from her desk, "we've been digging, and what we're finding, well, let's just say your situation is bigger than a broken arm." Sarah's throat tightened. "Sir." He opened a folder, not the slim one he'd carried before. This one was thick, papers stacked high, tabs jutting out like scars. "Admiral has a history," said, "one that should been dealt with years ago." He flipped pages, each one heavier than the last. Complaints, formal, informal, transfers that followed too closely to accusations, women reassigned after conflicts with him, evaluations praising his technical brilliance but quietly nodding leadership concerns. Sarah stared, breath caught in her chest. She had heard whispers, of course. Every command has its shadows, but here on paper was proof. Read aloud, his tone clipped. Petty Officer Jennifer, 2 years ago, reported cornered her in a supply room, made explicit remarks about her body, told her she'd never rise beyond secretarial work. She filed a complaint. Within weeks she was transferred. Case closed, no action taken. He turned the page. Lieutenant Commander Tours, documented pattern of women being passed over for operational assignments in favor of less qualified men, always justified as best fit for mission, always vague enough to protect him. He set the file down, meeting Sarah's eyes. This wasn't an isolated outburst on a parade ground. This was a man who's been at war with change for years, and yesterday he broke. Sarah's stomach churned, and no one stopped him. His face tightened. The system protected him. Rank has weight, networks have power, you know how it works. She did too well. She'd seen officers shield each other before, but never like this, never at this scale. Leaned back. Your confrontation pulled the lid off. The brass wanted a clean ceremony, an easy transition. Instead, they've got a scandal with fingerprints leading all the way up. Sarah exhaled slowly, her chest heavy. So I'm not just on trial for breaking his arm. No, said. You're at the center of whether the Navy can face itself, and that scares people more than anything. Silence stretched. The weight of it pressed on Sarah until she finally asked, what about the footage? His expression softened slightly. We've reviewed it. Multiple angles, it's clear he swung with intent. Your moves were defensive, textbook, proportional. Honestly, it's impressive. Hand-to-hand instructors are already talking about using it as a training example. Sarah's chest loosened just a fraction. Proof, at least proof. But's next words pierced that relief. Footage doesn't decide careers. People do. And some of them would rather bury this than admit what it reveals about and about themselves. He gathered his files but paused before leaving. His voice dropped lower, more personal. Lieutenant, I've investigated a lot of cases, seen a lot of people break under less than what you're carrying, but I'll tell you this, truth has a way of clawing through even when the system fights it. Hold steady. Don't let them write your story without you. Then he left, the door clicking shut, leaving Sarah alone again. That night she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the names had read. Tours, others she hadn't even heard before. Women erased quietly, their careers shuffled aside like cards in a game they never agreed to play. She thought of her own path, the long nights, the storms, the rescues, the promotions clawed from sweat and grit. And for the first time, she wondered how many others had been the chance to do the same. How many never made it this far because of men like. The guilt twisted into something sharper, anger, not just at him, at the silence that had enabled him, at the system that had looked away. At herself, maybe, for not asking harder questions before it came to this. The next morning she was called into a formal interview. Not in her quarters this time, in a stark room with a table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner. Sat across from her, but beside him now was another figure, Commander Lisa, her assigned defense counsel. Was calm, sharp-eyed, her uniform immaculate. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms, cutting through half-truths like wire. Lieutenant, she said as Sarah sat down, I've reviewed the footage, I've reviewed the complaints. I'll be direct. You did nothing wrong, but doing nothing wrong doesn't guarantee protection. So from here on, every word you speak matters. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. Began the questioning. Details, timelines. Did Sarah ever provoke? Did she ever insult him? Did she feel anger before he struck? Each question was surgical, designed to test consistency. Sarah answered carefully, her voice even, though her hands pressed tight in her lap beneath the table. When it was over, placed a steady hand on the table, leaning forward just enough. Lieutenant, remember this. You're not just defending yourself. You're defending the idea that women belong in this uniform without compromise. They will try to twist this into weakness, insubordination, fragility. Don't give them the satisfaction. Sarah met her eyes, something steadying inside her chest. I won't. The session ended, but the weight lingered. Outside the room, as Sarah was escorted back to her quarters, whispers trailed the hall. Sailors passing by, pretending not to look, but their eyes darted anyway. She caught fragments. She took him down like nothing. Career's over either way. Maybe she's what we need. Back in her quarters, Sarah sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling again. Only now her thoughts carried a different rhythm. She wasn't just waiting for judgment anymore. She was waiting to see if the Navy had the courage to face its own reflection. And deep down, she knew if it didn't, she would carry that truth anyway, alone if she had to. Why did silence echo louder at night than in the day? Sarah lay in her bunk, eyes open to the ceiling, sleep a stranger that refused to come. Every time her lids drifted heavy, the sound returned, that sharp crack of bone, scream tearing across the parade ground. She heard it as if it were happening again, a loop she could not escape. In the darkness, her hands trembled against the sheets. She pressed them flat, forcing stillness, as though discipline alone could silence memory. But discipline couldn't stop the weight crawling inside her chest. 8 years in the Navy had taught her to endure storms. She had stood on deck while waves reached higher than masts, while lightning carved the sky into jagged shards. She had faced exhaustion so deep she swore her bones might collapse beneath her. But nothing, not nature, not training, had prepared her for this storm. The storm of being alone with her own thoughts. She thought of her parents again. Her mother, who had cleaned offices long past midnight, hands raw with chemicals, whispering prayers Sarah never understood but always felt. Her father, quiet, working shifts so long that Sarah sometimes forgot the sound of his voice. They had never asked her to be extraordinary. They had only asked her to endure. But endurance now felt like drowning. In the silence, the questions rose unbidden. What if they decide I'm guilty? What if the Navy I gave everything to abandons me? What if, for the rest of my life, I'm not Sarah, sailor, officer, but just the woman who snapped an admiral's arm? Her stomach twisted. The idea terrified her more than any battle, being reduced to a single moment, being defined not by the rescues, the missions, the long nights she carried others through, but by one act of survival turned into spectacle. She sat up, pressing her palms into her knees, grounding herself. The quarters were too small, the air too thin. She wanted to run, to move, to breathe fresh air without guards at her door. Instead, she stared at the walls, as if willing them to widen. In the stillness, she whispered to herself, not prayers, just truths she needed to remember. You did what you had to. You didn't start it, you didn't want it, you stopped it. Her voice broke on the last word. Stopped it. But had she? Arm had broken. Yet his shadow still loomed larger than ever, filling headlines, filling whispers, filling the very air she breathed. He was gone from the base hospital, sedated and silent, but in every other way he still stood over her. She closed her eyes, gripping her hair between her fingers. For a moment she wanted to disappear, to not be the center of this firestorm, to hand it back and say, find someone else to be your symbol. But the Navy didn't work that way. Life didn't work that way. Once a symbol, always a symbol. The next morning came again, this time with no folder, no psychiatrist, no defense counsel. Just him, his face drawn, his eyes tired. You holding up? He asked, the question plain, human. Sarah hesitated, then answered honestly, barely. He nodded as though that was exactly what he expected. It's normal. Don't mistake it for weakness. Even steel bends under enough weight. She studied him. For the first time, he didn't look like the investigator. He looked like a man who had carried his own share of storms. Sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. You want to know the hardest part of this job? It's not the paperwork. It's not the politics. It's watching people like you, good sailors, break under pressure that isn't theirs to carry. Sarah's throat tightened. You think I'm breaking? I think you're human, he said. And humans weren't made to stand alone while the world argues over them like chess pieces. His words pressed into her like a hand on a wound, painful, but grounding. She lowered her eyes. I don't want to be their symbol. Too late, said softly. But here's the thing, you don't get to choose whether you're a symbol. You only get to choose what kind you'll be remembered as. The truth of it cut deep. When he left, Sarah sat in silence again, but something in her shifted. The fear was still there, heavy as iron, but beneath it flickered something faint. The idea that maybe, just maybe, she could shape this story before it buried her. That night she dreamed. She was back on the parade ground, the circle of soldiers around her. Lunged, his fist swinging, his face twisted with rage. Only this time when she caught his arm, it wasn't his. It was her father's, her mother. Every person who had ever told her she didn't belong. Every whisper, every smirk, every wall she had fought through. The crack came again, the scream. She woke drenched in sweat, gasping, the darkness pressing against her chest. Her heart hammered as she sat up, palms against her face. It wasn't just she had fought, it was every ghost that came before him. And maybe that was why the weight was so crushing now, because she hadn't just broken a man. She had broken something larger. By morning, her reflection in the small mirror looked older, not in years but in eyes. She pressed cold water to her face, straightened her uniform, and sat back down at her desk. The storm was still raging outside, but somewhere in the quiet she realized, storms could destroy, yes, but they could also cleanse. Maybe the question wasn't whether she had broken him. Maybe the question was what would be rebuilt after. Why did fear lose its grip the moment she decided not to hide? Sarah sat at her desk, the walls of her quarters pressing in as always, but for the first time she didn't feel small inside them. The fear was still there, yes, cold, gnawing, whispering that one wrong move could end her career, her life's work, her very name. But something had shifted. The storm wasn't just happening to her anymore, she was part of it. And storms, she knew, could be ridden. That morning, Captain returned. The defense counsel's uniform was sharp, her hair pinned perfectly, her eyes sharp behind calm glasses. She carried a thin folder, thinner than had been, thinner than Sarah expected. You've been quiet, said after the usual greetings. That's good, smart, but silence won't protect you forever. Eventually you'll need to speak, to investigators, to officers, maybe even to Congress. Sarah swallowed. What do I say? Studied her. The truth, nothing more, nothing less. But here's the thing, truth isn't just facts, it's presence, it's posture, it's showing them who you are, not just what you did. Because right now you're not just Sarah, you're the test case for whether the Navy can face itself. The words settled heavy but not crushing. For the first time, Sarah didn't flinch beneath them. I don't want to be their symbol, she said quietly. His eyes softened. You don't have a choice in that, but you do have a choice in how they see you. Humiliated, angry, or steady, unbroken. Sarah looked down at her hands, the same hands that had gripped his arm, that had redirected his rage into something final. They didn't shake now. They rested calmly on the table. I'll be steady, she said. Nodded, almost a smile flickering. Good, because they'll try to break you again. Not with fists, with questions, with insinuations, with the weight of institutions. Be ready. That night Sarah sat awake again, but not with fear, with reflection. She thought of the storm rescues she had led, sailors pulled from waves that wanted to swallow them whole. In those moments, there had been no thought of gender, of heritage, of prejudice. Only survival, only the mission. And yet here she was, facing the fiercest storm of her career, and the mission wasn't survival anymore. It was truth. The next morning, the base chapel bell rang 7 times, its sound carrying across the installation. Normally, Sarah barely noticed it. Today, the sound pulled her to the small window in her quarters. She stared through the glass, watching sailors cross the courtyard, their steps brisk, their faces unreadable. A few looked toward her building. She wondered what they saw: a pariah, a fighter, a warning. Her thoughts were broken by another knock at her door. Again. But this time, his expression carried something new: urgency. "They've set a preliminary board," he said without preamble. "Tomorrow, closed session. Senior officers, you'll testify." Sarah's heart jumped, but she forced her breath steady. Tomorrow. Yes, it's not formal court-martial. Not yet. But it's the step that decides if it goes that far. She nodded once firm. "I'll be ready." That night sleep didn't come. Instead, she sat with pen and paper, something tangible in her hands. She began writing. Not testimony, not statements, just truths. Lines that had lived in her chest for years, words she had never spoken. "I am not a quota. I am not a token. I am not less because I am different. I have earned every stripe, every post, every mission. I have saved lives. I have bled for this uniform, and I will not let one man's pride erase that." When dawn came, she folded the paper, slipped it into her jacket pocket. Not to read aloud, not to hand over, just to carry with her, a reminder of the ground she stood on. The board convened in a stark room at base headquarters. Long table, senior officers in rows, neutral faces, too polished to betray opinion, sat beside her, steady, composed. The questions came like artillery fire. Did she respect Admiral? Did she believe he was fit to lead? Did she consider refusing his challenge? Did she use unnecessary force? Each one tested her, probed her, searching for cracks. Sarah answered steady, clear, honest. "I respected his position, his service, but in that moment he was not acting as an admiral, he was attacking me. I considered disengaging. I tried. I offered him an out. He refused. I did not want to harm him. I wanted him to stop." Some officers nodded slightly. Others wrote notes without looking up. One narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced, but Sarah held steady. And then the question came that cut deeper than the rest. "Lieutenant," an older rear admiral asked, his tone calm, "do you believe your presence in the Navy, your gender, your heritage, influenced his actions toward you?" The room stilled, every ear tuned. Sarah's throat tightened. She could feel tense beside her, waiting. She could have said, "I don't know," could have played safe, but something inside her refused. Her voice came steady but low with weight. "Yes, I do." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Some eyes widened, some faces hardened, but Sarah didn't stop. "I've faced doubts my whole career. Whispers, questions about whether I earned my place." Admiral put those whispers into words in front of nearly 500 sailors, and then he tried to prove them with his fists. "But I didn't break because I don't belong here. I stopped him because I do." The silence that followed was heavy but not suffocating. For once, Sarah didn't feel crushed by it. She felt free. The board ended hours later, decisions left hanging in the air. She was escorted back to her quarters, exhausted but steady. That night she looked in the mirror again. Same uniform, same face, but different eyes, eyes that no longer belonged to someone hiding in silence. For the first time, Sarah felt the fear loosen its grip completely. She wasn't just surviving this anymore. She was standing in it. Why does the longest silence always come right before the verdict? Sarah stood outside the boardroom, the corridor quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Her palms were dry now, her breath steady, her body no longer trembling with the weight of the storm. She had given her truth. That was all she had. That was all she could give. Stood beside her, arms folded, expression unreadable but eyes watchful. leaned against the far wall, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had seen this moment too many times and knew better than to hope too loudly. The door opened. A young aide stepped out. "Lieutenant, they're ready." The walk into the room felt longer than any march Sarah had ever taken. She had crossed flight decks in storms, decks slick with seawater, but nothing compared to those few paces across polished tile. Nothing compared to the still faces waiting at the table. The senior officer in the center cleared his throat. His voice was calm, official, practiced. "Lieutenant, the board has reached its findings." The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Based on testimony, available evidence, and review of surveillance footage, it is the board's conclusion that you acted in self-defense. The use of force was proportional to the threat presented. No court-martial will be recommended. Sarah exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding for days. Relief washed through her, but it was tempered, controlled. Military training had taught her not to reveal too much, even in victory. But then came the second blow. "However," the officer continued, "given the public nature of the incident, the disruption to command, and the ongoing political pressure, the board recommends reassignment. You will not remain at this post. The Navy will determine the nature of your future service." The words landed like stone. She was cleared but not free, vindicated but marked. She had survived the storm, but the sky was not clear. "Do you understand, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady. The board adjourned. Chairs scraped, papers gathered, uniforms swayed as the officers filed out. Some gave her small nods, acknowledgement, maybe respect. Others avoided her gaze entirely. She stood in the emptying room, the echo of the verdict ringing louder than the words themselves. Self-defense, no court-martial, reassignment. It was survival, but it wasn't victory. Outside touched her arm lightly. "That's as good as we could hoped." Added, his voice low, "You stood your ground, Lieutenant. That's more than most could have done." Sarah nodded, though her chest ached. "Thank you, both of you." They left her then, and she walked alone across the base. Sailors moved past her, some stealing glances, others saluting stiffly, unsure whether respect or hesitation belonged in their gestures. She returned each salute with steady precision. Discipline mattered, especially now. At her quarters, she packed in silence. The Navy had taught her to move fast, to be ready for orders without warning. But this was different. Every folded uniform felt like a piece of her life being boxed away, uncertain where it would land next. She paused at the small mirror, catching her reflection. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who had stood on the parade ground days ago, trying to disappear into the formation. Her eyes were older, yes, but stronger too. She touched the pocket of her jacket where the folded paper still sat. The words she had written in the quiet when fear had nearly broken her. She unfolded it now, reading the lines again. "I am not a quota. I am not a token. I have earned every stripe. I will not let one man's pride erase that." The words steadied her again. At dusk, she walked across the courtyard one last time. The flag rippled in the evening wind, the sky streaked in fatting gold. Sailors passed by, their eyes flicking toward her, some with pity, some with respect, some with something else she couldn't name. But none of them ignored her, not anymore. And maybe that mattered more than anything. Her orders would come tomorrow, a new assignment, a different command. She didn't know if it would be career-making or career-ending. She didn't know if the Navy would see her as an asset or a liability. But she knew this. She would walk into it steady, unbroken. As she reached the edge of the courtyard, she paused, turned back just once, looking at the place where it had all unraveled. The parade ground, empty now, silent in the fading light. She could almost hear it again, the crack, the scream, the silence that followed. But she didn't flinch this time. She only breathed, steady, and whispered to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she turned, squared her shoulders, and walked into whatever came next.